Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our special webinar event, which will be led by Elder James Myers on the history and traditions in ABPsi. So without further ado, Elder James Myers, you can take it away. Welcome to our special webinar event, which will be led by Elder James Myers.
Good evening, everyone. Happy to be able to talk with you this evening about African-centered paradigms in the Association of Black Psychologists. So I prepared a brief PowerPoint, which was really designed to stimulate conversation. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to ask them during this webinar. Okay, Henry, next slide. So I thought I'd begin by just giving a historical context for ABPsi's creation. I'm sure most of you know this history and this story, but it bears repeating because, as one of our ancestor elders said, there's something wrong with the psychology and a psychological analysis that leaves African descent people strangers to themselves, aliens to their culture, oblivious to their condition, and less than human to their oppressor. So that's kind of the context for the creation of the Association of Black Psychology. There was a clear awareness that there was a major inadequacy of mainstream Western psychology when it comes to people acknowledging African descent. As a consequence, the requirement to go beyond a monoculturally hegemonic nature of Western psychology has proven to be a necessity, and so the Association of Black Psychologists has definitely taken on that charge. Thus, the development of Black African or Africana psychology as an alternative paradigm has been extant for over 40 years. And as you know, ABPsi is about to move into its 50th year. Next slide, please. So the 50-year history of ABPsi, 40-year history of the development of Black African, Africana psychology as an alternative paradigm. Because as you may or may not know, initially, all the members of the association, or the founding members of the Association of Black Psychologists, were members of the American Psychological Association. Recognizing the limitations of APA, they then withdrew to create ABPsi. So African psychology, Black psychology, Africana psychology is relatively new, but it was, the impetus was a need for a culturally syntonic approach to the psychology and experience of Black people across time and geography. And that was a far-reaching need. Mainstream Western culture and societies began to see Black people as less than human, chattel to justify European greed and materialism. I'm sure you're aware of that. Mainstream Western psychology played a key role in propagating that thinking, identifying the healthy, efficacious behaviors of people, Black people as insane, and the insane, self-destructive pathological behaviors as sane and preferable. For example, drapetomania, identification with the aggressor, alien self-disorder, anti-self disorders. So probably don't need to spend a lot of time talking about the need for ABPsi, but if you don't understand the need for ABPsi, then you won't understand ABPsi in its present condition. The Western cultural worldview compartmentalizes the spiritual aspects of being as though they do not inform the material. Dislodging the spiritual anchor severs the moral compass and stifles spiritual, moral, and higher levels of ego development, which leaves people adhering to this Western cultural worldview seeking peace, security, and well-being, and finding none, feeling insecure, fearful, alienated, angry, and in denial. And that's true in terms of the state of mainstream Western psychology. So ultimately, the fragmented nature of the worldview, Western worldview, fosters materialism, racism, sexism, classism, ageism, elitism, and other forms of privileging some groups based on appearances and disenfranchising others. Thus, we have pioneers in the field of Black Africana psychology emerging to develop their theories and research, and many using alternative African-centered paradigms. Next slide, please. Here are a few that I just pulled out that are familiar to you. Many are not with us any longer. Well, I guess only one not living is Asa Hilliard. But Naeem Akbar is still a major person, former past president. Kobe Kambon also does a lot of, or has been doing for quite some time, a lot of work in African-centered psychology. Myself, Wade Nobles, Thomas Parham, these are just a few who have done major work in the development of African-centered psychology. Next slide, please. So the emergence and articulation of a cultural paradigm and what is known as the wisdom tradition of African deep thought is really probably foundational in terms of the development of the Association of Black Psychologists as an African-centered organization. Again, if you have comments or questions as I'm speaking, feel free to let me know. Anyway, the emergence of this wisdom tradition can be traced from classical African civilization to present day and holds premises around which a number of Black psychologists have independently converged. Being present, I was a graduate student actually when ABPsi was first developing. I actually remember going to my first Association of Black Psychologists convention as a graduate student. And as a graduate student then, there was no Black psychology. And so most of the older members of the Association of Black Psychologists were in actuality the students, the graduate students who actually developed the theory and the foundational research for African or Black psychology. Some, like optimal conceptual theory, emerged utilizing an alternate set of assumptions, alternate to the Western model. And often they require self-knowledge, critical self-reflection, introspection, attunement with something greater than oneself, the ancestors, community, nature, and future generations. So as ABPsi has emerged from this African-centered perspective, there's certainly been a need for the implementation of culturally congruent theory, rituals, and languaging within ABPsi. Next slide, please. So as you know, ABPsi members, both students and professional, are not a monolithic group. And many have identified at least 3 schools of thought within Black psychology. We have the traditional school, which is mostly those scholars who are in concert with mainstream Western theory and models. Many of them have been members or are members of ABPsi. The reformist school, which is in concert with mainstream Western paradigms, but seek to modify in areas seen specific to Black people. And then the radical school, where the attempt is to develop and embrace African-centered cultural models. Some scholars in the African-centered school are inclusive, others are exclusive. And over time, you'll certainly begin to see who those are. My own work has been based on optimal conceptual theory, provides an alternative paradigm that has the capacity to embrace unity and diversity, allowing emphasis on the sustainability of one race, the human race, and inform how a just, sacred, sustainable world can be achieved, which will support health and well-being of all humanity. I stuck that in there because in some ways, my research and theory development is unique. There are a lot of African-centered researchers and scholars who don't necessarily embrace that orientation to African-centered psychology. There are some who are very much exclusionary, would not be interested in looking at humanity as a totality, but only interested in looking at Black people in particular. I throw that in simply because it helps us understand our topic of focus, which is the import of an African-centered psychology and worldview within the organization. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So African-centered thought is not monolithic, but there are certain central themes that we find in common. Almost always there's spirituality. The presupposition, articulated or not articulated, has to be in an African worldview that all is spirit, or as in classical African civilization, they said all is mind or all is consciousness. What's so interesting about that is that these ancient people had been affirming for thousands of years what Western science through quantum physics and neuroscience is just coming to understand. Another thing common is communality. I am because we are therefore I am is probably a common saying you'll hear people repeat. What they mean by that may differ, but just the realization that we're all interrelated and interdependent. And maybe not the realization yet that what is happening to the least of us happens to us all, but ultimately in terms of African-centered pedagogy and consciousness, that's where we're headed. Also, a common theme is the multidimensional nature itself, assuming that we're all an expression of the creative life force or source. We're one with ancestors, future generations, nature, and the community. So that then leads us to the primary cultural and ethnic orientations you find within ABPsi. As I mentioned from the outset, certainly classical African civilization is foundational. That leads us to ancient Kemet. In ancient Kemet, they didn't use vowels. So when you see people writing or trying to write, the Medu Neter, sometimes they'll use vowels, sometimes they won't. I tend not to, since they did not. These ancient people acknowledged that their ancestors came from the south and migrated north along the Nile Valley, moving up the valley through Ethiopia to Sudan. They were also known as Nubians, but ancient Kemites acknowledged that their ancestors were from the foothills of the Mountain of the Moon. So they were way south coming north. Probably the primary cultural and ethnic orientations that you'll see in ABPsi tends to be Yoruba. As you know, Yoruba is the largest ethnic orientation in the diaspora through Ifa. And it goes by many names: Santeria, Kendoble, Vodun, Lukumi. All of these are Yoruba Ifa-based African cultural ethnic orientations. Also common in ABPsi, you'll see people who are Akan in their orientation. Not many people followed the Dagara tradition. That's more of the kind of tradition you would see with someone like a Malidoma Some, who's very popular in mainstream culture. Wolof is popular, Dogon to a lesser degree, but there's certainly been interest. Bantu through the teachings of Tata Bunsika Fukiao, who many of us have studied with, also has top traditions that are often followed within ABPsi. Next slide, please. So, given that backdrop, there are many rituals that have been adapted and adopted by ABPsi. The one that you just see every other year is with the installment of officers is the installment, the Panansi, which is really African celebration created by Wade Nobles and Thomas Parham. And the first installment, I think, might have been Wade or Parham when they were installed as president, When I was president in the early 90s, they didn't use the installment of officers. Another thing you'll constantly see is the pouring of libations, which simply means giving honor to the Creator and those coming before our ancestors, those coming after, future generations, and sometimes nature and community, depending on the person pouring. Oftentimes they'll do this in Yoruba, very less, and sometimes in a Twi, which is the language of the Akan. We also have a tribute to the ancestors, which is usually early Saturday morning, where everyone dresses in white and usually tries to go to some place around water or nature in a park and give recognition to those upon whose shoulders we stand and to whom we're indebted. Oftentimes people give tribute to their own personal ancestors as well as the ABPsi ancestors, or the ancestors we've known to have contributed to the well-being of African people, particularly those of us in the diaspora. We also have the healing circles. As you may or may not know, in most African cultural traditions, the social organization is such that the communities move in gender-based kind of ways, so that women usually coalesce with their cohort of women, men with men, and the healing circles then are built upon that gender-based grouping, common to many African traditions. And our healing circles are designed to facilitate healing from them off, which is the term used to describe the African Holocaust. We also see at the convention Egyptian yoga and other healing practices that members have learned and then bring to the organization to share, oftentimes through morning exercises and sometimes through their presentations. Next slide, please. So there are many terms you'll hear frequently. I've just put out a few, and you can let me know if there are others you have questions about. You'll constantly hear people say Hotep, which means peace. That's coming from ancient Kemet or classical African civilization. You'll sometimes hear people say Alathia or Alathiani, which is Yoruba. And that's a greeting, which means I'm honoring the divinity in you. Also Sabone, which is Zulu, means the same thing. It's a greeting saying I'm honoring the divinity in you. You'll hear Madasi, Madasi Pa. Madasi is thank you. Pa is very much. So it's a Twi. Sometimes you hear people say Madasi Pa Pa Pa, meaning thank you very, very much. Medu Neter is coming from classical African civilization or ancient Kemet. Literally, Medu Neter means the words of God or the words of the divine. The ancient, our ancient ancestors from classical African civilization were so connected to spirit. They believed their very language, thoughts, and words that they spoke were actually God speaking through them. So that connection then is passed on. Neter means God or the divine or spirit. So one thing I would say is don't hesitate to ask a speaker using a term in your present what the term means. That's only respectful. So feel as though you have every right to ask someone, oh, okay, well, what does so-and-so mean? Or what is what you're doing meaning? Same is true if libations or other rituals are performed in an African language. Do not hesitate to ask the performer to translate what they've just said or are saying into English. I think it's only right that if we're going to hear someone pour a libation or do some sort of ritual for us as members of ABPsi, they ought not do it if they can't translate and let us know what they're saying so we can know how to respond. You'll hear people constantly say in libations, Ashe, which means let it be so. Their other abo is sometimes used, but oftentimes in ABPsi you don't hear abo, you hear people say ashe after the libation is poured, meaning let it be so. And having said that, I think we're at the end of my slides, except for the last one, which is really designed to sum up some of the essential premises of an African worldview. All of Africa that adheres a worldview based on what we might call the wisdom tradition of African deep thought assumes that all is spirit, or all is divine, or all is God. In that cultural worldview, there is no death. Realizing energy doesn't dissipate, it can only be recycled or transformed. The same would be true of your body, which is a part of nature. Within the African worldview, psychology is first and foremost devoted to the illumination of the soul, which kind of speaks to some of the ontological and epistemological premises that I've referred to so far. Also, African-centered thought emphasizes the fact that we as non-immigrant Africans in the Americas in particular suffer from epistemic violence and menticide. But really all African people due to colonization or chattel enslavement suffer from epistemic violence and menticide. As you know, menticide is the term coined by ABPsi founder Bobby Wright, who said menticide is a systematic destruction of a people's mind and a people's culture. So another premise of an African worldview is that our recovery, our healing, is dependent in part upon our increased self-knowledge. Self-knowledge in this context isn't just me knowing about me as an individual person, but me realizing who I am, my true self, as being one with the Creator. All major religions can trace their roots to Africa and classical African civilization. This is important for us to know because when you get into the fragmented worldview of Western culture, there's a lot of divisiveness between Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism. All of these major religions share similar assumptions. In fact, you find the story of a sage or a leader or a Christ being passed on from classical African civilization in the story of Isis, Horus, and Osiris, or that create that the story about a savior and the role of Mary or Isis, or the role of Joseph or Osiris or Asar, as those people were also known. So you can think about Horus and Asar and Aset as being the same as Isis, Horus, and the names about these ancients have been changed depending on who is languaging them at the time. But the ancients would say Asar, which is the father, Aset, which is the mother, and Horus, which is the son. So Africa is the birthplace of all human culture and civilization. All people are African people if they have that comprehensive view of humanity. Very few people do, and oftentimes African-centered people don't. But I just wanted to share these ideas because I think they are the foundation and create the framework for what you're seeing in ABPsi. And my research interest has always been trying to go back and fetch Sankofa, if you will, which is an Akan terminology. Go back and fetch the best within our African tradition and bring it forward. Comments or questions?
Yeah, that was amazing. So we have quite a few comments and questions, so I'm just going to jump right into it. One of the first ones were, can you speak to why, if it's important for students to explore positionality or situating themselves as scholars in general in a particular school? Goes back to the 3 different schools in Black psychology.
Why it's important for students to situate themselves, was that the question?
Yes. And why is knowing where a scholar is situated important?
So ABPsi is an organization that emerges from mainstream Western psychology because mainstream psychology was seen as deficient. So the whole purpose of ABPsi being created, the whole purpose of it forward, is to fill that breach, that gap in the production of psychological knowledge that the members of the Association of Black Psychologists felt couldn't be created within mainstream Western psychology. I think it's important for students to know about the different schools of thought because there have been and continue to be members of the association who are traditionalist. In other words, they see problems with mainstream Western psychology, but they haven't really broken with it in terms of their beliefs, values, or career aspirations. There are people within ABPsi who are reformist, still more mainstream focused, still not having broken, but made a particular take on an aspect. So it was the case 15, 20 years ago when people were very interested in Black identity. A lot of the people doing work in that area would fit within the reformist school. The radical school tends to be those researchers who have been interested in developing an alternative cultural paradigm for the production of psychological knowledge. Why is it important for students to know what those schools of thought are? Well, if you're going to be educated psychologist, you should know what the major schools of thought are within the association, just so you can be mindful or articulate. I think a part of that question is it necessary for students to identify with a particular school? I would say that's going to be specific to the student. Some are going to want to, some may not want to, but whether you consciously and deliberately choose to or not, when you publish your research, depending on how it's written, what premises you are building upon, you're going to be assigned to school.
All right, great. So the next question is kind of referred to some of the African traditions in ABPsi. And the first one was, who can do libations?
Anyone.
And okay. I think just
anyone can pour libations.
Okay. How do people become elders?
Okay, within the association, and that's in the bylaws, there are certain criteria to become an elder. I think you have to be a lifetime member. You have to, I don't think you have to have held office, but you have to be a lifetime member for a certain number of years. I don't recall what those would be. And the way one becomes an elder is the people who are already elders. Well, let me back up. If you're interested in becoming an elder, you would go to the people who are already elders and let them know that you have an interest in becoming an elder. And then they would make a determination based on what the criteria are. And those are in the bylaws. I don't know them off the top of my head, whether or not you're eligible to be an elder. I am a relatively new elder. or young elder. Pat Kenson and I are probably the only two elders that weren't a part of the initial elder group. But anybody can become an elder who wants to. What I found, and the reason I chose to become an elder, because in the Western cultural context, nobody wants to be an elder, being an elder with being old. With an African cultural tradition, you associate being an elder and having particularly knowledge. So I'm interested in seeing if I could support the Council of Elders, the current elders, because most of them weren't African centered in their training or in their research. Most of them went through their entire careers part of mainstream Western psychology, even though they might have that is kind of outside that realm. Most of them hadn't. So it would be good to have someone on the council who could help coach and support the other elders in learning more about what seemed to be the trend in the association, which is a movement toward an African-centered worldview.
Okay. The next question refers to the healing circles. And this question is, what if someone is gender nonconforming? Can they still participate in the healing circles?
I don't know that that's ever came up, that we had someone gender nonconforming. And if by that you mean they don't identify with either gender, in order to participate in the healing circles, they have to identify one gender. Start healing circle for the gender nonconforming.
Can you repeat that last part one more time? I think you were breaking up a little bit.
Because the healing circles have been created based on African cultural tradition, where you almost always have the women and the men, not necessarily, how can I say that differently? Men's groups and women's groups. If someone was gender non-conforming, they would either have to make a determination which group they'd want to participate in, or create their own gender non-conforming circle.
Okay, got it. The next question is, what role do you think epistemic positionality plays in Jegnership? Meaning, is it important to consider both worldview and field of study in matching?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, it might make sense if I'm a student who has a particular research interest in, say, psychology. It might make sense that I could gain more from Jagna, who also shared that. But I personally would think that any professional should be able to offer some support and guidance to any student in that, to be research specific. But that's just my opinion.
Okay. So the next question kind of goes towards thinking about some of the African history in ABPsi, some of the different cultures that ABPsi pulls from. And this question is, having been raised Christian and taught to denounce these traditions, how do we reconcile the creator we are attempting to commune with an Abrahamic God, or do we even have to?
How can we reconcile?
I guess reconcile communicating with the guys in African traditions while also being a Christian.
I think the key there is going to be to understand and study the roots of Christianity. Most African, in fact, I don't know any African culture. The source of all good, that kind of across the board. So I think two things complicate that. One,
So Elder James Myers, I think we're losing your connection a little bit. Can you repeat what you're saying? Sorry about that.
I was saying that if you help the cultural worldview of people who emerged, most of us have been omnipotent, omniscient, for
Unfortunately, it seems we lost Elder James Myers. She should be able to reconnect soon, so hold tight. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We have Elder James Myers back. So, can you hear us?
I can.
Okay, so you want to give it a shot with the last question that you started answering?
Sure. The question, as I understood it, was, can you repeat the question?
Yes. So, having been raised Christian and taught to denounce these types of traditions, how do you reconcile the Creator or guys we are attempting to commune with in His paradigm with the Christian God, or do we even have to?
I would say, for if I were the person asking the question, I would need to feel comfortable. So a couple of things occurred to me. The first part of the question of reconciling the African gods with the Christian. If we go back to the roots of Christianity, which happen to be in Africa, what we'll see is that all African groups that I'm familiar with believe in one God, an omnipotent, omniscient, creative life force whose nature is love, the source of all good, just as we do in Christianity. The challenge is that most of us don't know about the African roots of Christianity. Most of us come to Christianity from a Western cultural worldview, which is fragmented. And most of us are subject to our notions about African cultural beliefs and orientations to spirit from the perspective of Western anthropology, which is never understood. So, for example, that you would read the historians or anthropologists saying, well, you know, ancient Egyptians believed in sun god. No, the ancient Egyptians saw through symbolic imagery and rhythm and understood that if they wanted to look at something in nature as representative of all that God is, it could be the sun, because on the earth plane, without the sun, what? There is no life. It's not that they worship the sun as God, they just saw God or the sun as a good representation of what God is. So when you learn more about an African-centered worldview, particularly based on the wisdom tradition of African deep thought, you see that there's really not any conflict between Christianity and most African traditions. The reason I say most is simply this. If Africa is the birthplace of all humankind, all that is in Africa, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What my research has been interested in is what I call the wisdom tradition of African deep thought. That kind of narrows then the focus of a tradition within African culture traditions that we can kind of count on, because there will be African cultural traditions that are not positive but negative, just like there are Christians and Christian traditions that are not positive and are negative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me.
What about to the person asking the question?
We'll give them a few seconds to respond and
Okay.
follow-up questions. There's another question. How do these Afrocentric schools of thought respond to the current wave of cultural competence and doctoral training?
Cultural competence in doctoral training requires some proficiency and knowledge of the deep structure of culture. Most cultural competency orientations tend to look at the surface structure of culture, meaning those aspects of culture you can see, how the language people speak, their dress, their diet, their music, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's all well and good, but really what differentiates people, more importantly than the surface structure of culture, is the cultural deep structure, meaning those philosophical assumptions and principles that shape the way we view the world, not only informing our designs for living, but also our patterns of interpreting reality. So I can't speak for all African-centered or Afrocentric psychologists, because again, as I said before, we're not a monolithic group, but I can speak for African-centered psychology as I've developed it and know it, to say that you really can't claim cultural competency or proficiency until you have some knowledge of the deep structure of culture. And
Great.
what the cultural differences are at that depth.
A person who asked the previous question said it makes perfect sense what your response was.
Oh, good.
Okay, and this question goes back to optimal psychology, and this person just asked if you could talk a little bit more about OCT and how you developed the theory.
You're going to be sorry you asked that question. You can't ask a professor to talk about her theory in less than 3 hours. No, just kidding. The short story is this. Early on, when I was in graduate school, I became quite concerned that my professors did not see racism as a mental health issue. And I wanted to understand how people could behave so badly as to kidnap young children, young adults from a continent, transport them as animals, chattel, to the Americas to build their wealth and think that was okay. What in the hell are they thinking? Or how is it that you discover something clearly utilized by other people, claim it as your own, then call them more like primitive savages if they want it back? I'm going, what in the world? So the theory of optimal psychology emerges from my attempt to try to understand racism, other societal isms, and how people could be seeing the world that they felt such horrific behavior was okay, because these people seem to think that way. What I realized then in my analysis is it had to do with the philosophical assumptions and principles grounding their cultural worldview. They saw the world from an ontology that had them separating the spiritual aspect of being from the material aspect. And when you do that, you cut yourself off from what would be the spiritual anchor, the moral compass, and therefore you have none. And when you do that, the materialist view allows you to be more concerned about acquisition of objects, greed, materialism, than you are about what's right, what's just, what's sustainable. Having done that analysis, and that's a whole another 2 hours, but for that little snippet, I concluded these people had a less than optimal worldview or a suboptimal worldview that was fragmented and disintegrating. And that's what led them to behave so badly. I then began to be asked the question, wasn't this just the nature of all human nature? My answer was absolutely not. When I look at my own cultural heritage, which is African and Native American, we did not see the world and do not see the world in that way. That led me then in my generals process. We used to have to do generals research in addition to dissertation research. Mm-hmm. I went to Africa and looked at how deviance was conceived in African cultural tradition. I went all over the continent, really trying to understand if what I had learned as a non-immigrant African American could be seen on the continent in terms of how people were viewing the world, what they were adopting as their designs for living and patterns of interpreting reality. That led me to classical African civilization, the wisdom tradition of African deep thought, which yielded the ontological premise that all is spirit. And so being, we're not separate from spirit. And so my researchers spent a lot of energy looking at this wisdom tradition of African deep thought. Optimal conceptual theory then is a theory of optimal psychology that has with it a corollary psychotherapeutic approach called belief systems analysis. Because as I developed the theory, people would ask, well, so how do I shift from this fragmented suboptimal view I've been socially engineered and brainwashed into to a more optimal view? Because as I look at the differences in those worldviews, I really do have an affinity for the African worldview. All of this is in my first book called Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. So belief systems analysis is the psychotherapeutic psychoeducational approach I developed to help people shift from the fragmented suboptimal Western view to a more holistic and integrative optimal African view. I also have what I call the optimization process and the heart feather strategy. So much of my career being trained as a clinician has been not just developing theory, but also trying to develop psychotherapeutic, psychoeducational processes that can help people overcome the menticide and diminish the epistemic violence.
Amazing. Okay, so we have time for one more question. And this question is, what role does therapist identity and loss of identity via slavery and forced migration play in our execution of Black psychology?
Wow, say that again.
I know, it's deep, right? What role does therapist identity and loss of identity via slavery and forced migration play in our execution?
Are you saying be it slavery or enforced migration?
Yeah, either through like losing identity, either through slavery or forced migration.
Uh-huh.
How does that impact how we execute Black psychology or execute to Black psychology?
So to the extent that our identity has been shaped by either chattel enslavement or forced migration, we need to withdraw and heal ourselves before we can claim to be a psychologist, because there's very little we can do to help anyone if we've not helped ourselves. So one of the key premises I mentioned earlier is that our recovery is dependent in part on our own increased self-knowledge. We have to come to know who we irrespective of how we've been socialized, miseducated, socially engineered, brainwashed, and oppressed to believe we are what the dominant white supremacist Western culture would lead us to believe about ourselves. And that having been said, if we don't engage in that process, I don't really know how we can be effective as Black psychologists. Not that we have to, let me say it differently. What we're interested in here is healing, and there's not an outcome of being healthy in a toxic, pathological social context that one achieves. It's a developmental process. So as long as I'm in a toxic, pathological social context, if I've not brought myself to conscious awareness enough to overcome the menticide, reverse the psychology of oppression process, and get to true understanding myself from what I call a more optimal worldview, then I'm not going to be able to be effective. What I'm so excited about is I've been blessed to live long enough to see others use my psychotherapeutic approaches with people for the last 17 years, and they have found it to be very useful and very helpful. So I'm one who definitely believes that we need to work on healing ourselves, engage in processes that are going to support our overcoming the psychology of oppression process that was designed to make us shift from a more optimal African-centered view to a more fragmented white supremacist Western view, and begin to heal and learn how to shift back to a more optimal African-centered view where we can get in touch with who we really are as intrinsically worthy human beings.
Okay, thank you. And the person that asked that question said, thank you. That was very enlightening.
Thank you.
One last question with the few minutes that we have left, because I think it's a very interesting question. Someone asks, has there been any pushback from APA about ABPsi using African traditions in therapy or practice? Or has there been any instance where these traditions have conflicted with APA's ethical codes?
No, I've been involved with APA for quite some time now. I don't know of any. More than anything, what I see is I've engaged for the past 4 or 5 years with APA around ethics through the Council on National on CNPMAs. So the Ethnic Psychological Associations have an organization. I've represented ABPsi for the past few years, and the APA is always asking us to talk about ethics. So more than anything, we as ABPsi have taken to task APA for their lack of capacity to treat people acknowledging African ancestry, because they haven't dealt with their own racism, and they still are a part of a white supremacist system that supports the propagation of racism and societalism. Now, in terms of people who are practicing traditional African beliefs or practices in their psychological practice, I'm not one of those, but I do know there are people who do try to bring that in, and I don't think you'd ever find APA railing against that. What you might find is some state psychological associations who do the licensing within the state maybe pushing back, but even that said, I don't know of that ever having happened. I personally don't know of that ever having happened. I know there are past presidents. So I know Mawia Kambon, who is an Akan priestess, does use her being an Akan priestess in her psychotherapeutic approach, but I don't know if she does it as a psychologist or she just represents herself as an Akan priestess with psychological knowledge. I don't know that. I'm trying to think who else might use their African ethnic identity and praxis in their practice. And I've not seen that. There's certainly not going to be pushback from APA because they've got their own problems to deal with.
All right, awesome. Well, that was our last question. I want to thank everybody for their patience during the technical difficulties. Thank you, Elder James Myers. This was a lot of great information. You've been getting a lot of positive feedback in the chat, and I'll tell you all about it later.
Okay.
Any closing remarks or comments?
Only to say, I am so thankful for each and every one who participated this evening. I, for one, realize and remember when I was in your shoes. And the whole purpose of what we elders have gone through is for you, so that you can help all people, because I consider all people African people, but if you can help people acknowledging African descent, not everybody acknowledges it, to heal. Because within the Western cultural frame, that production of psychological knowledge really hasn't yielded what we need to be healthy human beings so that we can have a sense of sustainable well-being. And I believe that it will be you all that are going to carry that forward and help humanity heal and realize our purpose as human beings. In fact, oh, that's a whole nother story. Never mind. That's all I say.
All right, great. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks so much. Thank you, Henry.
Bye-bye.